On a grey morning after the storm, locals walk among rubble, while the river, overflowing with trash and mud, roars loud and unstopping. A man runs to the water's edge and points. A German shepherd is being swept away, lifeless, covered in bags and branches. On the opposite bank, an empty stroller tips into the mud unnoticed. The shout, "Where's the baby?" freezes everything. Among debris, the dog lies still. The child, covered in mud, touches its snout and rests their forehead on its head. A moment of complete silence no one will ever forget. Love animal stories? Then subscribe now and never miss one. Thanks for being with us. Now, back to our story. Chapter 1. The Flood. The storm that had ravaged the small town of Pinecrest, Vermont, through the night had transformed the usually gentle creek into a raging torrent of muddy water. The peaceful New England community, nestled between rolling hills and dense forests, now faced the aftermath of nature's fury. Debris collected over months, plastic bags, broken branches, and household items swirled violently in the churning water that cut through the heart of the town. On that grey morning, residents were scattered along Main Street, collecting pieces of roofing tiles, soaked clothes, and furniture that had been torn away by the force of the floodwaters. The sound of the rushing creek was still deafening, drowning out conversations and leaving an atmosphere of alertness at every corner. The historic wooden buildings that gave Pinecrest its charm now stood damaged and vulnerable, their foundations tested by the relentless water. Eleanor Mitchell, a retired schoolteacher, in her 70s, stood on her porch watching the cleanup efforts with worry etched across her face. Her German shepherd Duke had been unusually restless since dawn, pacing and whining at the door. Duke had been Eleanor's faithful companion for the past 8 years, ever since her husband Harold had passed away. The dog's elegant stride and watchful demeanor were familiar sights to everyone in Pinecrest as he accompanied Eleanor on her daily walks through town. "Stay inside, Duke," Eleanor said firmly, closing the door despite the dog's protests. She needed to check on her neighbor, Martha Reynolds, who lived alone and might need help clearing debris from her yard. As Eleanor made her way down the slippery steps of her Victorian home, she heard Duke's frantic barking from inside. Something was clearly bothering him, but the elderly woman was determined to help Martha first. Several yards down the street, Jason Winters, a local firefighter, was helping the Miller family salvage what remained of their garden shed. His radio crackled with updates about road closures and minor injuries around town. The 35-year-old had been on duty all night, his usual calm demeanor tested by the seemingly endless emergencies. "Jason," called Olivia Parker, a nurse at Pinecrest Medical Center, who had been helping an elderly man clear debris from his driveway. "Mrs. Reynolds needs help with a fallen tree," Jason nodded, wiping sweat from his brow despite the cool morning air. "I'll be right there," he replied, securing a tarp over the Miller's belongings before jogging toward Martha's house. The creek that ran through Pinecrest normally added to its postcard-perfect charm, with stone bridges and weeping willows creating idyllic scenes worthy of a Norman Rockwell painting. Now it was a menacing force that had already claimed garden sheds, fences, and even a small wooden footbridge that connected the east and west sides of town. A sudden commotion near the main bridge drew everyone's attention. A group of residents had gathered at the creek's edge, pointing and shouting. Among them was Eleanor Mitchell, who had abandoned her plans to help Martha when she heard the commotion. "What's happening?" asked Rebecca Wilson, a young mother who held her toddler Lily tightly in her arms. "Someone said there's something in the water," replied George Thompson, the owner of the local hardware store. "Looks like an animal got caught in the current." As the small crowd grew, gasps and cries of distress rippled through them. There, tumbling helplessly in the muddy torrent, was a large German shepherd. The dog's normally proud stance was gone as it spun between plastic debris and broken branches, its body partially submerged, disappearing and reappearing between the dirty whirlpools of the current. "Duke!" Eleanor's anguished cry cut through the sound of the rushing water. "That's my Duke!" No one had noticed the elderly woman's arrival, but now all eyes turned to her as she fell to her knees at the creek's edge, her hand outstretched toward the water as if she could somehow reach her beloved companion. "How did he get out?" Jason asked, arriving at the scene breathless. "I don't know," Eleanor whispered, her voice breaking. "I left him inside, but he must have found a way out." The town's residents watched helplessly as Duke was carried downstream, his dark form occasionally visible among the debris. Jason and a couple of other men ran along the bank, trying to keep pace with the current. But the creek was too swollen, too fast, and too dangerous to attempt a rescue. "He's gone around the bend," someone called out. "We can't see him anymore." Eleanor could only murmur Duke's name over and over, too shocked to scream or run. Her neighbor Martha had arrived, and now stood beside her, a comforting arm around the elderly woman's shoulders. The crowd fell silent, the only sound, the relentless rush of the creek's waters. On the other side of town, near where the creek widened and slowed before entering the forest preserve, Emma Carlson was checking her backyard for damage. The single mother had moved to Pinecrest just 6 months ago with her 18-month-old son, Ethan, seeking a fresh start after her divorce. Their modest rental home sat at the edge of town, with a yard that sloped gently down toward the creek. Emma had left Ethan with her mother, Caroline, while she assessed the damage to their small vegetable garden. The storm had uprooted most of her carefully tended tomato plants and flooded the lower section of their yard. As she picked up broken plant stakes and ruined tomatoes, she heard her mother's voice calling from the house. "Emma, come quick!" Something in Caroline's voice made Emma's heart jump. She dropped the garden tools and ran toward the house, her boots sinking into the mud with each step. As she reached the back porch, she saw her mother standing there, looking frantically around the yard. "What's wrong?" Emma demanded, breathless. "I can't find Ethan," Caroline said, her voice tight with fear. "I was putting away the breakfast dishes, and he was playing with his blocks in the living room. Then I heard the door, but when I came to check..." Emma didn't wait for her mother to finish. "Ethan!" she called, scanning the yard. "Ethan, where are you?" The toddler had just learned to walk confidently and had recently discovered how to open the screen door. Emma had installed a child-proof lock, but in the chaos of the storm cleanup, someone might have forgotten to secure it. "Check inside again," Emma instructed her mother. "I'll look outside. He can't have gone far." But as Caroline rushed back into the house, Emma's eyes were drawn to the creek at the bottom of their yard. The water was still high and fast, though not as violent as it had been during the night. Something large and dark had washed up among the reeds and debris where the current slowed around a natural bend. Emma's breath caught in her throat. Taking careful steps down the slippery slope of her yard, she moved closer to the creek's edge. What she saw made her stop in her tracks. It was a large German shepherd, its wet fur matted with mud and debris, lying motionless among the reeds. But what froze Emma in place wasn't the dog. It was the small figure standing beside it. Ethan, in his blue overalls and yellow rubber boots, was standing at the water's edge, his tiny feet sinking into the mud. He was looking down at the dog with an expression of curious concern that seemed far too mature for his 18 months of life. "Ethan!" Emma called, her voice a mixture of relief and panic. "Stay there, baby! Don't move!" But Ethan didn't seem to hear her. As Emma began to carefully make her way down the slippery bank, she watched in astonishment as her son bent down and placed his small hand gently on the dog's muzzle. The toddler then did something that made Emma's heart skip a beat. With the uncertain balance of a child who had only recently mastered walking, he crouched down and pressed his forehead against the German shepherd's head. Emma wanted to rush forward, to snatch her son away from the strange animal, but something held her back. The moment seemed charged with an inexplicable energy that she dared not interrupt. And then, the impossible happened. The German shepherd made a muffled sound, a kind of sigh. Emma held her breath. The dog moved one of its front paws, coughed up water, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, opened its eyes. In that moment, standing on the muddy bank of a creek swollen by the previous night's storm, Emma Karlsson witnessed something she would never be able to fully explain. It wasn't a miracle, not in the traditional sense. It was something more primitive, more fundamental, a connection between two living beings that transcended understanding. It was a call to life, answered. Chapter 2. Unexplained Connection. "Mom! Mom!" Emma called out, her voice carrying across the yard. "Call Jason Winters. Tell him we found a dog." Caroline appeared on the back porch, her eyes widening at the scene below. "Ethan! Oh my God!" She started down the slope, but Emma waved her back. "Just call Jason. Tell him we found a German shepherd by the creek." As Caroline disappeared inside, Emma carefully made her way toward her son and the dog. The German shepherd's eyes were now fully open, watching the approaching woman with wary alertness despite its weakened state. "Easy," Emma whispered, more to herself than to the animal. "Easy now." Ethan remained crouched beside the dog, his small hand now resting on its wet fur. The toddler looked up at his mother with an expression that seemed to say, "I fixed it." Emma had never seen such a look on her son's face before, a mixture of satisfaction and wisdom that seemed completely at odds with his age. "Ethan, honey, come to Mommy," Emma said softly, extending her hand. To her surprise, the toddler shook his head. "Dog," he said firmly, one of the few words in his limited vocabulary. The German shepherd made another sound, not quite a whine, but a communication nonetheless. It tried to lift its head, but could only manage to raise it an inch before letting it fall back to the muddy ground. Emma heard voices approaching from the direction of town. Looking up, she saw Jason Winters leading a small group that included Eleanor Mitchell, supported by Martha Reynolds as she walked. "It's down here," Emma called out, waving to them. The relief on Eleanor's face was palpable even from a distance. "Duke!" she cried, her voice cracking. "Oh, thank God!" Jason reached them first, his trained eye quickly assessing the situation. "The dog's alive," he confirmed, sounding surprised. "But how did the little guy get down here?" He gestured toward Ethan, who was still refusing to leave the dog's side. "I don't know," Emma admitted. The gravity of what could have happened suddenly hitting her. "He must have slipped out while Mom was in the kitchen. I found him. He was already here with the dog." Jason knelt beside Duke, his hands gently examining the animal for injuries. "He's exhausted and probably has water in his lungs, but I don't feel any broken bones. That's a miracle considering how far he was swept downstream." Eleanor had reached them now, tears streaming down her face as she carefully lowered herself to the ground beside her beloved pet. "Duke, my sweet boy," she whispered, stroking his wet fur. Duke's tail moved slightly at the sound of his owner's voice, a weak thump against the mud. "We need to get him to Dr. Collins," Jason said, referring to the town's veterinarian. "And we need to warm him up. He could be in shock." "I have some blankets in the house," Emma offered. "I'll get them," Martha volunteered, already turning to head up the slope. Ethan, still crouched beside Duke, reached out and placed his hand on the dog's ear, gently stroking it the way Emma had taught him to pet their neighbor's cat. The gesture was so tender, so deliberate that everyone fell silent, watching the interaction between the toddler and the dog. "Has he always been good with animals?" Eleanor asked softly. Emma shook her head. "We don't have pets. He's only ever petted Mrs. Greenberg's cat a few times." She paused, then added, "I don't understand how he got down here or how he knew to—" She trailed off, unable to articulate exactly what her son had seemed to know. Jason stood up. "Let's get a tarp or something to use as a stretcher. I can carry him, but it would be better to keep him level." As the adults discussed logistics, something remarkable was happening that none of them immediately noticed. Duke's breathing was becoming stronger, more regular. His eyes, initially glazed and distant, were becoming more focused, particularly when they rested on Ethan. Martha returned with blankets, and Jason began to arrange them to create a makeshift stretcher. Emma finally managed to coax Ethan away from the dog, lifting him into her arms despite his protests. "Dog sick," Ethan said, pointing at Duke. "Yes, honey, the dog is sick," Emma agreed, "but we're going to help him." What happened next would later be recounted to neighbors, friends, and eventually to journalists and curious visitors from neighboring towns. As Jason and another man from the group prepared to lift Duke onto the blanket, the German shepherd suddenly raised his head and let out a clearer, stronger whine. His eyes were fixed on Ethan. Then, with effort that seemed beyond his condition, Duke rolled onto his stomach and pushed himself up onto shaky legs. "Duke," Eleanor gasped. "No, boy, lie down, you're hurt." But Duke didn't lie down. Instead, he took one unsteady step, then another, moving deliberately toward Emma and Ethan. The small crowd watched in astonishment as the dog, who minutes ago had seemed barely conscious, walked with increasing steadiness toward the toddler. Ethan wiggled in his mother's arms, clearly wanting to be put down. After a moment's hesitation, Emma lowered him to the ground but kept a firm hold on his overall. "Straps." Duke reached them and stopped, his eyes level with Ethan's. The toddler reached out and once again placed his small hand on the dog's muzzle. Duke responded by gently licking the child's wrist, a gesture so tender it brought tears to several observers' eyes. "I've never seen anything like it," Martha whispered to no one in particular. "He was nearly gone," Jason said, his professional assessment at odds with what he was witnessing. "He should barely be conscious, let alone walking." Eleanor approached slowly, not wanting to interrupt the strange communion between her dog and the toddler. "Duke has always been sensitive," she said quietly, "but this is something else entirely." The connection between Duke and Ethan was undeniable, though inexplicable. It was as if they were communicating on a level beyond understanding, the 18-month-old child and the 8-year-old German shepherd locked in a silent exchange that excluded everyone else. "We should still get him to Dr. Collins," Jason insisted, though his voice held less urgency now. "Even if he's walking, he could have internal injuries." "Of course," Eleanor agreed, finally reaching Duke's side and gently attaching his leash to his collar. "Come on, boy. Let's get you checked out." Duke turned from Ethan reluctantly, looking back at the toddler as Eleanor gently guided him up the slope. The small crowd followed, helping Eleanor navigate the slippery ground while supporting Duke when his legs threatened to give way. Emma remained behind for a moment, holding Ethan in her arms, watching the procession make its way up to the road, where Jason's truck waited. "What did you do, little man?" she whispered into her son's ear. "How did you know?" Ethan didn't answer, but he watched Duke with an intensity that was unsettling in one so young. It was as if a part of him understood exactly what had transpired, even if he lacked the words to explain it. The news spread through Pinecrest with the speed that only small-town gossip can achieve. By nightfall, nearly everyone had heard about Duke's miraculous survival and the strange role played by the Carlson boy. Versions varied. Some said Ethan had performed CPR, others claimed he had spoken to the dog in complete sentences despite his limited vocabulary, and still others suggested that the toddler had somehow known Duke was in danger and had gone specifically to save him. The truth, as Emma recounted it to Dr. Sarah Collins while the veterinarian examined Duke in her clinic, was strange enough, without embellishment. His vital signs are remarkably normal, Dr. Collins said, adjusting her stethoscope as she listened to Duke's heart. Some water in the lungs, but it's clearing. No broken bones, no signs of internal bleeding. She straightened, up a puzzled expression on her face. By all accounts, Eleanor, your dog should be in much worse shape. Lenore, who hadn't left Duke's side since they arrived at the clinic, stroked her pet's head lovingly. He's always been strong, she said, but I've never seen anything like what happened today. Dr. Collins looked at Emma, who sat in a chair. In the corner of the examination room, Ethan asleep in her lap. And you say he just touched the dog, and then Duke woke up? Emma nodded. He put his hand on Duke's muzzle, and then he pressed his forehead against the dog's head. It was... I can't explain it. It was like he knew exactly what to do. Children have an affinity for animals, Dr. Collins said, though her tone suggested she didn't quite believe her own explanation. And animals respond to gentle touch. Still, it wasn't just that, Emma insisted quietly, careful not to wake Ethan. It was like they recognized each other. Like there was a connection between them that shouldn't have been possible. Doctor. Collins removed her gloves and made some notes on Duke's chart. Well, whatever happened, Duke is remarkably lucky. I'd like to keep him overnight for observation, but I expect he'll make a full recovery. As the women spoke, Duke's eyes remained fixed on the sleeping Ethan, his gaze steady and alert despite his ordeal. There was something in that gaze that went beyond the usual canine intelligence, a recognition, an awareness that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries between species. Later that evening, after Emma had put Ethan to bed and reassured her mother that both she and her son were fine, she sat on her back porch looking out at the creek. The water was still high, but no longer raging, the worst of the flood receding as quickly as it had arrived. Her phone buzzed with another text message, the fifth from a neighbor asking about what had happened with the miracle dog. Emma ignored it just as she had the others. She wasn't ready to discuss what she had witnessed, wasn't sure she could find the words to describe it accurately. From inside the house, she heard Ethan's voice through the baby monitor. He wasn't crying, just talking in the half-formed words and babbles typical of a child his age. But one word came through clearly, repeated over and over. Dog, dog, dog. Emma shivered despite the mild evening air. Something had changed today, something fundamental in the fabric of her small world. The connection between her son and Duke seemed to have awakened something, not just in the dog, but in Ethan himself. And somehow, Emma knew that this was just the beginning. Chapter 3. Ripples Through Pinecrest. The following days brought a strange new rhythm to Pinecrest. As the town recovered from the flood, cleaning mud from streets and repairing damaged homes, another current was flowing beneath the surface of daily life, whispers about what had happened by the creek. Dr. Collins released Duke the day after the incident, declaring him remarkably healthy considering his ordeal. I've never seen such a rapid recovery, she told Eleanor as they left the clinic. It's as if he was never swept away at all. Eleanor brought Duke home to her Victorian house at the end of Oak Street, expecting him to need rest and careful. monitoring. Instead, the German shepherd paced restlessly by the front door, whining and scratching at the wood. "What is it, boy?" Eleanor asked, concerned that he might be in pain despite Dr. Collins's assurances. Duke's answer was to bark once, sharply, his eyes fixed on the door with an intensity that Eleanor had never seen before. "You want to go out? But you need to. Rest," she insisted. The dog's response was to trot to the window that faced in the direction of Emma Carlson's house, press his nose against the glass, and whine again. Eleanor's realization was sudden and unsettling. "You want to see the boy?" she said softly. Duke turned to look at her, his intelligent eyes seeming to confirm her suspicion. Eleanor wasn't sure what to make of this new behavior. Duke had always been a friendly dog, good with the neighborhood. Children who would stop to pet him during their walks. But this fixation on Ethan Carlson was something entirely different, a desperate need that seemed almost human in its intensity. Across town, Emma was experiencing her own version of this strange new reality. Ethan, normally content to play with his blocks or look at picture books, now spent hours standing at the living room window that faced the creek, occasionally pointing and saying "dog" with increasing insistence. Duke is at his home with Ms. Eleanor, Emma would explain patiently. He needed to rest after his adventure in the water. But Ethan wasn't satisfied with this explanation. Each time, he would look at his mother with an expression that seemed far too knowing for his age, then return to his vigil at the window. Caroline, who had been staying with them since the flood, watched her grandson with growing concern. "It's not normal," she told Emma in a hushed voice while Ethan napped. "The way he looks for that dog, the way he connected with it. Children his age don't behave that way." "He's always been empathetic," Emma defended, though she shared her mother's unease. "Remember how he used to pat my face when I cried after the divorce?" "This is different," Caroline insisted. "The way he found that dog when no one else could, the way he knew what to do. It's not just empathy, Emma. It's something else." Emma had no answer for that because deep down she agreed. Something unexplainable had happened by the creek, something that had forged a connection between her son and Duke that defied rational understanding. The ripples of that event spread throughout Pinecrest in the days that followed. At the corner cafe, it was the main topic of conversation over morning coffee. At the harvest market, shoppers paused between produce aisles to exchange theories and impressions. "My cousin's a vet tech in Burlington," said Diane Williams, the elementary school secretary, as she selected apples at the market. "She says animals that have been underwater that long don't just get up and walk away. Their lungs fill up, their organs shut down. It's just not possible." "Well, I was there," countered George Thompson, the hardware store owner. "I saw that dog get swept away, and I saw him later that day walking out of Dr. Collins' clinic looking like he'd just had a bath, not like he'd nearly drowned." "Explain that." No one could, of course, and as the stories circulated, they grew. Some claimed that Ethan had walked across the raging creek without getting wet. Others insisted that Duke had been completely lifeless before the boy touched him. Pastor Michael Bennett of the Pinecrest Community Church offered his own perspective during Sunday service, where attendance was notably higher than usual. "We live in a world of wonders," he told the congregation, many of whom had never witnessed the incident firsthand but now felt personally invested in it. "The Lord works in mysterious ways, through the most unexpected vessels. Sometimes it takes the pure heart of a child to remind us of the miracles that surround us every day." Not everyone embraced this spiritual interpretation. Dr. Collins, who attended the service out of long-time habit rather than deep conviction, approached the pastor afterward. "With all due respect, Michael," she said quietly, "attributing natural phenomena to divine intervention doesn't help us understand what actually happened." Pastor Bennett smiled kindly. And reducing miracles to natural phenomena doesn't nourish the soul, Sarah. Some things aren't meant to be understood, just appreciated. This philosophical divide extended throughout the town. Some residents, like Marcus Russell, the high school science teacher, sought rational explanations. The dog was probably never as close to death as people thought, Marcus suggested during a faculty lunch meeting. Animals have remarkable survival instincts, and children often seem to have special connections with animals. It's well documented that pets respond differently to infants and toddlers than they do to adults. Others, like Martha Reynolds, embraced the mystery wholeheartedly. "I've lived in Pinecrest for 70 years, she declared to anyone who would listen, and I've never seen anything like what happened between that child and Duke. There are forces in this world beyond our understanding, and we'd do well to respect them." The local newspaper, the Pinecrest Gazette, ran a front-page story titled "Miracle by the Creek" that attempted to present both perspectives while avoiding definitive conclusions. The article featured quotes from witnesses, including Jason Winters, whose credibility as a first responder lent weight to the more supernatural interpretations. "I've pulled people and animals from floodwaters before," Jason was quoted as saying. "I know what near drowning looks like. Duke shouldn't have survived, and he certainly shouldn't have been walking around hours later. I can't explain what happened when Ethan touched him, but I know what I saw." The article concluded with a statement from Emma, who had reluctantly agreed to be interviewed. "My son has always been a special child, but what happened that day by the creek was beyond anything I can explain. All I know is that two lives came together in a moment that changed them, both." 3 days after Duke's rescue, Eleanor Mitchell made a decision. Watching her beloved pet's increasing distress as he paced and whined and stared longingly out the window, she picked up the phone and called Emma Carlson. "I hope I'm not overstepping," Eleanor said hesitantly after introducing herself. "But Duke hasn't been himself since that day by the creek. He seems desperate to see Ethan. I wonder if it might be possible for them to spend some time together." On the other end of the line, Emma felt a wave of relief. "Ethan's been the same way," she admitted. "He stands at the window for hours, looking in the direction of town and saying 'dog' over and over. I was thinking of calling you, but I wasn't sure if it would be appropriate." They arranged to meet that afternoon at the small park near the center of town, a neutral space where both Duke and Ethan might feel comfortable. The reunion was nothing short of extraordinary. As Emma walked into the park with Ethan in his stroller, Duke, who had been lying quietly beside Eleanor on a bench, suddenly leapt to his feet, ears forward, tail wagging with such force that his entire body seemed to vibrate with joy. Eleanor barely managed to keep hold of his leash as the German shepherd pulled toward the approaching pair. Ethan, spotting the dog, began bouncing in his stroller and clapping his hands, his excitement palpable. "Well," Eleanor said with a smile as Emma parked the stroller beside the bench, "I think they're happy to see each other." Emma unstrapped Ethan, who immediately scrambled down and toddled toward Duke with more coordination and purpose than she had ever seen him display. The dog, for his part, sat perfectly still, tail still wagging but body controlled, as if he understood the need to be gentle with the small human approaching him. What followed was a reunion that seemed more like that of old friends than of a toddler and a dog who had met only once before under traumatic circumstances. Ethan wrapped his arms around Duke's neck in a hug that the dog accepted with dignified patience. Then the toddler stepped back and placed his hand on Duke's muzzle in exactly the same way he had done by the creek. Duke responded by gently licking Ethan's hand, then lying down on his stomach, placing his head on his paws in a posture of complete submission, something Eleanor had never seen him do with anyone, not even with her. "It's like they understand each other," Emma said, softly, watching as Ethan sat down beside Duke and began stroking his fur with a gentleness that seemed beyond his years. "I've had dogs all my life," Eleanor replied, "but I've never seen anything like this. It's as if they share a language that we can't hear." The two women watched in fascinated silence as Ethan and Duke continued their silent communion. The toddler would occasionally speak a word, dog, good, friend, but mostly he communicated through touch, his small hands, moving over Duke's fur with deliberate care. For his part, Duke seemed transformed by the child's presence. The restlessness that had plagued him since returning home was gone, replaced by a calm alertness. His eyes never left Ethan, and when the toddler stood up and took a few steps away, Duke followed, matching his pace to the child's unsteady gait. "Look at that," Eleanor said, pointing to where Duke had positioned himself beside Ethan, his body angled slightly to create a barrier between the child and a nearby street. "He's protecting him." It was true. Duke had placed himself in a guardian position, his attention split between Ethan and their surroundings, alert to any potential threat to his small charge. "I've never seen him do that with anyone but me," Eleanor continued, a note of wonder in her voice. "Not even with the neighborhood children he's known since they were born." As Emma and Eleanor watched this extraordinary interaction, they were unaware that they themselves were being observed. Across the park, sitting on another bench with a newspaper that he wasn't reading, was Dr. James Anderson, a professor of behavioral psychology at the State University who had driven to Pinecrest after hearing about the incident from a colleague who subscribed to the Pinecrest Gazette. Dr. Anderson had come expecting to find an exaggerated small-town tale, the kind of collective myth-making that often followed unusual events in close-knit communities. What he was witnessing instead challenged his professional skepticism. The interaction between the child and the dog displayed patterns of bonding and communication that in his 20 years of studying animal-human relationships he had never observed. As Ethan and Duke played together, with the toddler occasionally, throwing a small ball that the dog would gently retrieve and place back in his hands, Dr. Anderson made notes on his phone, his academic interest thoroughly piqued. What none of them realized, not Emma, not Eleanor, not even Dr. Anderson with his trained eye, was that the connection forming between Ethan and Duke was only the first of many such bonds that would soon transform the small town of Pinecrest into a focal point for phenomena that would challenge the boundaries between science and faith, between the explainable and the mysterious. The creek that had nearly claimed Duke's life continued to flow through the town, its waters gradually receding to normal levels. But the current of change that had been set in motion when a small boy placed his hand on a drowning dog's muzzle was just beginning to gather force. Chapter 4. Unexpected Gifts. A week after the flood, Pinecrest was returning to its normal rhythms, or trying to. Street sweepers had cleared the last of the mud from Main Street. The bridge over the creek had been inspected and declared safe. Sandbags still lined some doorways, but most had been removed and stacked behind the town hall for the next emergency. What hadn't returned to normal was the connection between Ethan Carlson and Duke. Each morning, Eleanor would take Duke for a walk that inevitably led to Emma's small house at the edge of town. There, the German Shepherd would sit patiently at the gate until Ethan, who somehow always knew when Duke had arrived, would toddle to the front door calling, "Dog, dog," with infectious excitement. Emma and Eleanor had fallen into an easy friendship. Bonded by the strange circumstance that had connected their lives, they would sit on Emma's porch, drinking coffee, while Ethan and Duke played in the fenced yard. "He's sleeping through the night now," Emma told Eleanor one crisp morning as they watched Ethan throw a ball for Duke. Ever since he started seeing Duke regularly, before he would wake up 2 or 3 times crying or calling out. Eleanor nodded, unsurprised. Duke's the same way. He used to be restless at night, especially after Harold passed. Now he sleeps soundly. She paused, then added with a slight smile, though he does dream about Ethan. His paws twitch and he makes these little sounds, almost like he's talking. Emma watched her son, who was now sitting beside Duke with one arm draped over the dog's back, both of them looking toward the creek with identical expressions of alert interest. "They're so in tune with each other," she said softly. "It's like they share thoughts." Eleanor followed her gaze. "I've had dogs all my life, but I've never seen anything like this. It's as if what happened that day by the creek opened something between them." What neither woman mentioned, though both had noticed, were the other changes that had begun to manifest. Ethan, who had been slightly behind. His peers in verbal development, according to his pediatrician, were suddenly speaking in clearer, more complete sentences. Words that had been challenging for him just weeks ago now flowed easily, and his vocabulary was expanding at a rate that both delighted and slightly alarmed his mother. Duke, too, displayed new behaviors. He had always been intelligent, even for a German shepherd, but now he seemed to anticipate needs and events with an almost uncanny precision. He would go to the door minutes before Eleanor received a phone call informing her that someone was coming over. He would fetch Eleanor's medication before she realized it was time to take it, and most remarkably, he seemed to understand complex sentences and requests that went far beyond the simple commands he had been trained to respond to. "It's as if they're borrowing from each other," Dr. Collins suggested when Eleanor brought Duke in for a follow-up examination. "Ethan is developing the heightened awareness that dogs naturally possess, and Duke is developing more human-like cognitive patterns." She hesitated, then added, "Though that's just a theory, there's no scientific basis for such an exchange." The connection between Ethan and Duke might have remained a local curiosity, a story to be shared over coffee at the corner cafe, if not for what happened at the Thompson household 3 weeks after the flood. Lily Thompson, 4 years old, and the youngest of 3 children, had been born with a severe heart defect that had required multiple surgeries. Though the procedures had been successful, Lily remained frail, her energy limited, her activities restricted. She attended preschool only 3 days a week and often had to rest while her classmates played. On this particular day, Lily's mother, Rebecca, had taken her to the park, hoping the fresh air would be good for her. They encountered Emma, Ethan, and Duke, who had become regular visitors to the park. While Rebecca and Emma chatted on a bench, Lily approached Ethan and Duke cautiously. She had always been wary of dogs, their exuberance too overwhelming for her delicate system. "Can I pet him?" she asked Ethan, her voice barely audible. Ethan, who at 20 months old would normally have been too young to understand or respond to such a question, looked at Lily with solemn eyes. "Duke gentle," he said clearly. "Duke help." Rebecca, overhearing this exchange, was about to intervene. Lily was not supposed to get too excited or upset, but something in the calm assurance of Ethan's response made her hesitate. Lily reached out a thin hand toward Duke, who remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the little girl with an intensity that might have been alarming in any other context. When her fingers touched his fur, Duke made a soft sound, almost like a purr, and moved closer to her. What happened next would later be described by Rebecca, through tears, to a room full of astonished neighbors. Lily placed both hands on Duke's head, much as Ethan had done that day by the creek. Duke responded by pressing his forehead gently against her chest, directly over her scarred heart. They remained that way for nearly a minute, connected in a silence that seemed to exclude the rest of the world. Then Lily stepped back, her pale face flushed with a color Rebecca hadn't seen in years. "Mommy!" Lily called, turning toward Rebecca with a wide smile. "My heart feels warm." Rebecca rushed to her daughter, instinctively checking for signs of distress. Instead, she found Lily breathing easily, her usually blue-tinged lips pink, her eyes bright with an energy that had been absent since her birth. "I want to run, Mommy," Lily declared. "Can I run with Ethan?" Before Rebecca could respond, Lily had taken off across the grass, her thin legs carrying her with a strength and coordination she had never displayed before. Ethan followed, giggling, with Duke trotting beside them, watchful but relaxed. Rebecca stood frozen, watching her chronically ill daughter run and play like any other 4-year-old. "This isn't possible," she whispered, her hand pressed to her mouth. Emma moved to stand beside her. "I don't know what's happening," she said quietly, "but I saw something like this before, when Ethan found Duke by the creek." They watched as the children played. Lily's laughter, a sound Rebecca realized she had rarely heard in its full, uninhibited form, ringing across the park. That evening, Rebecca took Lily to Dr. Michael Grant, who had been treating her since birth and who had performed 2 of her 3 heart surgeries. "Her color is remarkably improved," Dr. Grant noted as he examined Lily, who was sitting on the examination table, swinging her legs, another new behavior, "and her energy level seems much higher than at our last appointment." "She ran today," Rebecca said, still not quite believing it herself. "Actually ran across the park, twice, without getting winded." Dr. Grant raised his eyebrows. That would be quite unusual given the extent of her condition. He placed his stethoscope against Lily's chest, listening intently. After a moment, his expression changed from professional interest to confusion. "The murmur is significantly reduced," he said, moving the stethoscope to different positions, "and her heart rate is steady and strong." He performed several more tests, each one increasing his bewilderment. "I want to run some more comprehensive tests," he said finally. "An echocardiogram, at minimum. The change in her symptoms is dramatic." The tests, performed the following day at the regional hospital, revealed what Dr. Grant would later describe as medically inexplicable improvements in Lily's cardiac function. The structural defects that had been only partially corrected by surgery showed signs of regeneration that, according to all medical literature, should not have been possible. "I can't explain it," Dr. Grant told Rebecca and her husband John as they sat in his office reviewing the test results. "The heart doesn't spontaneously repair itself this way, especially not in a matter of hours or days, but the imaging is clear. Lily's heart is functioning at nearly 85% of normal capacity, up from 60% at her last evaluation 6 weeks ago." John, a construction foreman who had always approached his daughter's condition with pragmatic determination, struggled to process this information. But what caused it? What changed? Rebecca hesitated, then shared the story of Lily's encounter with Duke and Ethan at the park. As she spoke, she was acutely aware of how implausible it sounded, a dog and a toddler somehow triggering a medical transformation that years of advanced surgical interventions had failed to achieve. Dr. Grant listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When Rebecca finished, he leaned back in his chair and removed his glasses. "In 27 years of practice," he said slowly, "I've learned that there are aspects of healing that we don't fully understand. The placebo effect, spontaneous remission, the impact of psychological factors on physical health, these are all documented phenomena that sometimes defy our current medical models." He replaced his glasses and leaned forward. "I can't tell you that what happened with this dog caused the changes we're seeing in Lily's heart, that would be scientifically irresponsible. But I also can't offer you a better explanation for why your daughter, who has never been able to run across a room, without becoming cyanotic, is now running across a park with normal color and respiratory function. The Thompsons left Dr. Grant's office with mixed emotions: joy at Lily's improvement, confusion about its cause, and a nagging fear that such an inexplicable change might be temporary. The next day, they returned to the park, hoping to find Emma, Ethan, and Duke. They were there along with Eleanor, who had taken to joining them for these outings. Lily ran to Ethan and Duke immediately, her newfound energy still a source of wonder to her parents. The German shepherd greeted her with the same gentle attentiveness he had shown before, and Ethan smiled at her with a wisdom that seemed impossible in a child so young. "Duke made my heart better," Lily announced to Ethan, placing her hand over her chest. Ethan nodded solemnly. "Duke special," he replied. "Ethan special too." As the children played with Duke, Rebecca approached Emma and Eleanor, who were sitting on their usual bench. "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice low and urgent, "about what happened yesterday, about Duke and Ethan." Eleanor patted the space beside her. "You're not the first to ask," she said kindly, "though I'm not sure we have any answers." Rebecca sat down, her eyes never leaving Lily as she ran and climbed and jumped with an ease that, just days ago, would have been impossible. "The doctors can't explain it," she said. "Lily's heart, it's healing itself. They've never seen anything like it." Emma nodded, unsurprised. "Something is happening here," she said quietly. "Something that started that day by the creek when Ethan found Duke. I don't understand it, but I can't deny it either. Do you think—" Rebecca hesitated, aware of how strange her question would sound. "Do you think they could help others? Other children with illnesses or conditions?" Eleanor and Emma exchanged glances. It was a question they had discussed privately, but had been reluctant to consider too deeply, aware of the responsibility and attention such abilities would attract if acknowledged publicly. "We don't know the limits or rules of whatever this is," Eleanor said carefully, "and I'm concerned about what would happen if word spread too widely. Ethan is still just a baby, and Duke is a dog, special as he may be." Rebecca nodded, understanding their caution. "I won't tell anyone else," she promised. "But Lily, she's been struggling her whole life, and now she's running and laughing like any other child. Whatever this is, it's real, and it's beautiful." As indeed they spoke, none of them noticed Dr. James Anderson, who had returned to Pinecrest for the third time since the flood, sitting on a distant bench with a notebook open on his lap. He had been observing Ethan and Duke for weeks now, documenting their interactions and the growing circle of connections they were forming. Today, he had witnessed the exchange between Lily, Ethan, and Duke, noting the marked difference in the little girl's physical capabilities compared to his previous observations. As a scientist, he was trained to be skeptical, to seek rational explanations for seemingly inexplicable phenomena. But as he watched Lily cartwheel across the grass, an activity that should have been impossible given her medical history, which he had discreetly researched, he found himself considering possibilities that went beyond his conventional understanding. Dr. Anderson closed his notebook and stood up, his decision made. It was time to approach Emma Carlson and Eleanor Mitchell directly. Whatever was happening in Pinecrest, whatever connection had been forged between a toddler and a dog that had nearly drowned in a flood, it deserved to be understood, not just observed from a distance. As he walked toward the bench where the three women sat, he was unaware that he was about to become part of a story that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the boundaries between humans and animals. between science and phenomena that defied scientific explanation. And none of them, not Dr. Anderson, not the three women, not even Ethan and Duke themselves, could have predicted how their lives would intertwine in the weeks to come, or how the quiet miracle that had begun by the creek would ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the boundaries of their small town. Chapter 5. The Awakening. "I've been observing you for several weeks now," Dr. James Anderson said, his tone professional, but gentle as he introduced himself to Emma, Eleanor, and Rebecca. "I'm a behavioral psychologist specializing in human-animal connections. What I've witnessed between Ethan and Duke, and now with Lily, is unprecedented in my field." The women exchanged uneasy glances. Emma was the first to speak. "You've been watching my son?" Her voice carried a protective edge. Dr. Anderson held up his hands in a placating gesture, "Only in public spaces and always at a respectful distance. I apologize for not approaching you sooner, but I wanted to observe without influencing the interactions." He gestured toward the children and Duke. "What's happening here could be scientifically significant." Eleanor, who had instinctively moved closer to Emma, studied the man with cautious interest. "Scientifically significant how?" "Interspecies empathic bonding at this level is extremely rare," Dr. Anderson explained. "And the apparent physiological effects," he nodded toward Lily, who was now hanging upside down from the jungle gym, her face flushed with healthy color, "are beyond anything documented in peer-reviewed literature." Rebecca leaned forward. "You mean you believe what happened to Lily is real? Not just coincidence or—" She hesitated. "Imagination?" "I believe something very real is occurring," Dr. Anderson confirmed. "Something that deserves careful, respectful study." He turned to Emma. "With your permission, of course." Emma watched Ethan, who was now sitting beside Duke under a maple tree, the two of them seemingly engaged in silent communion. Her son had always been special, perceptive, gentle, with an emotional intelligence that sometimes startled her. But since the day by the creek, he had become something more, a bridge between worlds she hadn't known existed. "What would this study involve?" she asked cautiously. Dr. Anderson outlined his proposal: observation sessions, gentle interviews, with all involved, documentation of interactions, all conducted with full transparency and the right to withdraw at any time. "My goal isn't to exploit or sensationalize," he assured them. "It's to understand." After lengthy discussion and with certain boundaries established, Emma, Eleanor, and Rebecca agreed to participate in Dr. Anderson's study. None of them could have anticipated how quickly things would evolve from there. Within 2 weeks, word of Lily's transformation had spread throughout Pinecrest despite the family's attempts at discretion. The changes in her were too dramatic to hide. A child who had once been confined to careful, limited movements was now racing her brothers across the school playground. Then came 7-year-old Marcus Jenkins, whose severe stutter had resisted years of speech therapy. His mother, desperate after hearing rumors about Lily, brought him to the park one afternoon when she knew Ethan and Duke would be there. The interaction was brief but profound. Duke approached Marcus with the same gentle attentiveness he had shown Lily. Ethan, now speaking in surprisingly complete sentences for a child not yet 2, took Marcus's hand and placed it on Duke's head. "Talk to Duke," Ethan instructed. "Duke listens good." Marcus, who typically avoided speaking in public due to the frustration of his stutter, knelt beside the German shepherd and began to whisper in his ear. No one heard what the boy said, but the connection was visible to all. The same focused intensity, the same sense of communication happening on a level beyond words. The next day, Marcus raised his hand in class for the first time in his school career. When called upon, He answered the teacher's question in a clear, fluid sentence that caused the classroom to fall silent in astonishment. By the end of the month, Dr. Anderson's simple observational study had expanded to include documentation of 7 cases of what he termed unexplained therapeutic responses following interactions with Ethan and Duke. Each case followed a similar pattern: initial contact, a period of intense connection that seemed to exclude everyone else, and then changes that defied conventional medical or psychological explanation. What we're witnessing appears to be a form of energy transfer, Dr. Anderson explained to a small group that had gathered in Emma's living room one evening. The parents of the children who had experienced changes, along with Emma, Eleanor, and Dr. Collins, who had been documenting the physiological aspects of the phenomena. Ethan and Duke seemed to function as a unit, he continued, displaying charts on his laptop. Their brainwave patterns, which we've been able to record non-invasively, synchronize when they're together, and when they interact with others, particularly children with various challenges, there appears to be a temporary entrainment effect. "In English, please," requested John Thompson, Lily's father, who still struggled to reconcile his daughter's miraculous improvement with his pragmatic worldview. Dr. Collins stepped in. "They're sharing energy, in a way. Or perhaps more accurately, they're helping others rebalance their own energy." She glanced at Dr. Anderson. "It's not a medical explanation, but it's the closest analogy I can offer." Eleanor, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Duke was different even before the flood," she said softly. "More aware, more connected. But after Ethan found him by the creek, it's as if something was awakened in both of them." Emma nodded. "Ethan too. He always had an old soul, as my mother says. But now..." She looked toward the corner of the room where Ethan sat playing with blocks, Duke lying beside him. "Now it's like he understands things no child his age should understand." Dr. Anderson followed her gaze. "What I find most remarkable is that neither of them seems aware of how unusual their connection is. To them, it's simply natural." The meeting continued, with parents sharing stories of changes they had observed in their children and Dr. Anderson offering potential frameworks for understanding what was happening. But beneath the scientific discussion ran a current of something deeper, a growing awareness that what was unfolding in Pinecrest transcended conventional explanations. As the group disbanded, Dr. Anderson pulled Emma aside. "There's something I haven't shared with the group yet," he said, his voice low. "Reports are coming in from other communities affected by the same flood. Similar phenomena, not identical, but with common patterns." Emma felt a chill run down her spine. "Other children and animals." "Yes, but also other pairings, elderly residents with plants that suddenly thrive under their care, a musician whose playing now induces profound emotional responses, a chef whose food seems to heal old emotional wounds." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture that betrayed his scientific composure. "It's as if the flood water itself carried something that activated latent connections in those exposed to it." Emma thought of the creek that ran behind her property. Its waters now returned to normal levels, but forever changed in her perception. "The water from the mountains," she murmured. Dr. Anderson nodded. "The headwaters of the creek originate in an area with unusual geological properties. There are stories, legends really, about the healing properties of certain springs in those mountains. I've always dismissed them as folklore, but now..." Their conversation was interrupted by Ethan, who had approached silently. Duke, at his side. "Water remembers," the toddler said clearly, his eyes meeting Dr. Anderson's with unnerving directness. The psychologist crouched down to Ethan's level. "What does the water remember, Ethan?" "Everything," the child replied simply. before turning and walking back to his blocks, Duke following closely. Emma and Dr. Anderson exchanged glances, both unsettled by the exchange. "His vocabulary," Dr. Anderson began. "I know," Emma said. "It keeps expanding. Words he shouldn't know, concepts he shouldn't understand." She watched her son, love and wonder, and a touch of fear mingling in her heart. "Sometimes I wonder who he's becoming." The question lingered, unanswered, as autumn settled over Pinecrest. The flood that had nearly destroyed the town was now being reframed in the collective consciousness of its residents, not as a disaster, but as an awakening. The creek that had been a source of destruction had also become a source of transformation, carrying something mysterious from the mountains that had activated hidden potentials, forged unexpected connections. Dr. Anderson's study expanded, drawing interest from colleagues who arrived with sophisticated equipment and skeptical minds, only to leave with data that challenged their scientific paradigms and questions that had no easy answers. Through it all, Ethan and Duke remained at the center, not as subjects of study or sources of miracles, but as beings who had found each other at a pivotal moment and formed a bond that somehow created space for others to heal. Eleanor, watching Duke interact with a group of children at the park one crisp October day, reflected on how completely her life had changed since the flood. What had begun as a near tragedy, the loss of her beloved companion, had transformed into something she could never have imagined, a front-row seat to what she had come to think of as grace made visible. "He's happy," Emma said, sitting down beside her and nodding toward Duke, who was allowing the children to take turns placing their hands on his head in a ritual that had become familiar throughout Pinecrest. "They both are." Eleanor nodded. "They've found their purpose." She turned to look at Emma. "Have you decided about Dr. Stevens' offer?" Dr. Melissa Stevens, a neurologist from Johns Hopkins who had joined Dr. Anderson's research team, had approached Emma about bringing Ethan and Duke to Baltimore for more comprehensive studies. The offer included all expenses, accommodation for both Emma and Eleanor, and assurances about ethical treatment and limited testing. "I'm still thinking about it," Emma replied. "Part of me wants to understand what's happening to Ethan, to Duke, to all of us. But another part..." She watched as Ethan guided a shy little girl's hand to Duke's muzzle, his face solemn with concentration. "Another part feels like explaining it might somehow diminish it." Eleanor understood. Over the past months, she had fielded countless questions about Duke, about the flood, about what had happened that day by the creek. She had given the facts as she knew them, but the heart of the matter, the inexplicable connection, the healing that defied medical explanation, remained beyond words, beyond science. "Whatever you decide," she told Emma, "we'll face it together. All three of us." The bond between them had grown as strong as the one between Ethan and Duke, different in nature, but born from the same remarkable circumstance, the same acceptance of mystery. As they sat watching the children take turns connecting, with Duke, a new arrival caught their attention. Pastor Bennett approached, leading a frail, elderly man whom Emma recognized as Walter Hayes, a reclusive resident who lived at the edge of town and rarely participated in community events. "Eleanor, Emma," the pastor greeted them. "Walter was hoping to meet Duke and Ethan. He's been following the stories from a distance." Walter, his thin frame supported by a cane, nodded shyly. "I don't mean to intrude," he said, his voice wavering with age, "but I had to see for myself." Eleanor smiled warmly. "You're not intruding at all. Duke loves meeting new friends." She called to the German shepherd, who immediately looked up, then trotted over, Ethan following closely behind. What happened next added another chapter to the growing legend of Ethan and Duke. As Walter tentatively extended a trembling hand to Duke, the dog moved forward and gently pressed his muzzle against the elderly man's palm. Ethan, without prompting, placed his small hand on top of Walter's. For a moment, the three of them stood connected, the elderly man, the toddler, and the dog, forming a circuit of touch that seemed to exclude the rest of the world. Then Walter gasped, a sound of surprise rather than distress. "The pain," he whispered. "It's receding." Walter had suffered from crippling arthritis for decades, the pain a constant companion that had gradually isolated him from the community. Now, as he stood with his hand sandwiched between Duke's muzzle and Ethan's palm, the lines of suffering etched into his face began to soften. When the connection finally broke, Walter straightened, up his grip on his cane loosening. With cautious wonder, he flexed his fingers, then rotated his wrist, movements that had been impossible minutes before. "How?" he asked, looking from Duke to Ethan with tears in his eyes. Ethan, his expression serious beyond his years, spoke with the simple wisdom that had become characteristic of him. "Water connects everything," he said. "Remember?" Walter nodded slowly, though it was clear he didn't fully understand. None of them did, not really. But understanding seemed less important than accepting, than witnessing, than allowing oneself to be part of something that transcended explanation. As autumn deepened toward winter, the phenomena that had begun with Ethan and Duke expanded in ways no one could have predicted. The children who had experienced healing or transformation began to exhibit heightened empathic abilities of their own. Lily Thompson, her heart now functioning at near normal capacity, showed an uncanny ability to sense when others were in emotional distress. Marcus Jenkins, his stutter completely resolved, developed a gift for mediating conflicts among his peers. Dr. Anderson, whose simple observational study had evolved into a multidisciplinary research project with colleagues from across the country, struggled to keep pace with the expanding ripples of change. "It's as if the initial connection between Ethan and Duke created a template," he explained during one of the weekly community meetings that had become a fixture in Pinecrest. "And now that template is being replicated, adapted, expanded upon by others who have been touched by it." "Like a stone dropped in water," Emma suggested, "creating ripples that spread outward." Dr. Anderson nodded. "Exactly, and each ripple carries the same fundamental pattern, but expresses it in unique ways." The metaphor resonated with everyone present. Water, the creek that had flooded, the rain that had fallen, the mountain springs that fed the watershed, had become central to their understanding of what was happening. Not in a scientific sense, but in a symbolic one. Water as connector, as carrier, as medium for transformation. On a cold November morning, 6 months after the flood that had changed everything, Emma stood by the creek behind her house, watching as Ethan and Duke played along its banks. The water was low now, clear and cold, nothing like the raging torrent that had nearly claimed Duke's life. Ethan, now approaching his 2nd birthday, had grown in ways both normal and extraordinary. He was taller, more coordinated, his vocabulary expanding daily, but he had also developed an awareness, a presence, a capacity for connection that set him apart from other children his age. Duke, too, had changed. Not just in his almost human understanding and his healing interactions, but in subtle physical ways. His coat had taken on an unusual sheen. His eyes seemed to hold more depth, and his movements had acquired a grace that went beyond his natural canine athleticism. As Emma watched, Ethan crouched by the water's edge and dipped his fingers into the creek. Duke sat beside him, alert but relaxed, his gaze following the ripples that spread from Ethan's touch. "Look, Mama," Ethan called, pointing to the water. "It's talking." Emma moved closer, curious. The surface of the creek was indeed rippling in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, concentric circles that overlapped and intersected in ways that water normally wouldn't move. "What is it saying?" she asked, playing along with what she assumed was a child's game. Ethan looked up at her, his eyes reflecting the clear blue of the autumn sky. "It says, more are coming." A chill that had nothing to do with the November air ran through Emma. "More what, honey?" "More like me and Duke," Ethan replied matter-of-factly. "More connections. The water is waking things up." Before Emma could respond, Duke stood up, his attention suddenly focused upstream. His posture wasn't alarmed, merely alert, expectant. Ethan, too, turned to look in the same direction. "Someone's coming," he said quietly. Emma scanned the creek, bank, but saw no one. "I don't see—" "Not here yet," Ethan interrupted, "but soon." He looked back at the water, then up at his mother, a smile spreading across his face, the simple, joyful smile of a child his age, momentarily displacing the old soul wisdom that had become his hallmark. "It's going to be wonderful, Mama." Emma believed him. Despite the strangeness, despite the inexplicable nature of everything that had happened since the flood, she had come to trust the new reality that was unfolding, not just around her son and Duke, but throughout Pinecrest and beyond. Whatever was awakening, whatever connections were being formed, they carried a fundamental benevolence, a healing intention that transcended understanding, but invited trust. As they made their way back to the house, Duke, walking beside Ethan with the protective attentiveness that had become his constant mode, Emma reflected on the journey that had brought them here. What had begun as a near tragedy, a dog swept away by floodwaters, a toddler mysteriously drawn to his side, had evolved into something that defied categorization but undeniably enriched lives. Dr. Anderson had taken to calling it the Pinecrest phenomenon, a term that was gaining recognition in certain scientific circles. But to those who lived it daily, it was simpler than that. It was connection between species, between individuals, between minds and hearts that normally remained separate. Eleanor was waiting on the porch when they returned, her face alight with the peaceful joy that had become her normal expression since Duke's transformation. "Dr. Anderson called," she told Emma. 3 more cases reported in Millfield. Millfield was the next town downstream, where the same flood had caused similar damage. Emma nodded, unsurprised. "Ethan says more are coming. The water is waking things up, according to him." Eleanor glanced at Ethan and Duke, who had settled on the porch steps together, the boy's small hand resting on the dog's head in what had become their characteristic pose. "Do you ever wonder where it will end?" Emma followed her gaze, love and wonder filling her heart. "I don't think it will," she said softly. "I think it's just beginning." And in that moment, watching her son and the dog, who had become so much more than a pet, watching the bond between them that had somehow expanded to touch lives throughout their community and beyond, Emma knew she was witnessing something rare and precious. The birth of a new kind of connection, a new way of being that honored the boundaries between species, between individuals, while simultaneously transcending them. The creek continued to flow behind her house, carrying water from the mountains through Pinecrest and onward, connecting communities, carrying whatever mysterious element had been awakened that stormy night 6 months ago. And Ethan and Duke, the unlikely pair whose bond had sparked a transformation that was still unfolding, continued to sit side by side, 2 beings who had found each other in a moment of crisis and forged a connection that changed not just themselves, but the world around them. Whatever came next, whether it was more children and animals forming similar bonds, more healing that defied medical explanation, or something not yet imagined, it would build upon the foundation that had been laid. In that day by the creek, when a small boy had placed his hand on a drowning dog's muzzle and called him back to life. It wasn't an ending, it was an awakening, and it was just beginning. Dear listeners, we hope that the story of Ethan and Duke has touched your hearts. Their extraordinary connection reminds us of the mysterious bonds that can form between humans and animals, and the healing power of compassion. For more emotionally captivating stories like this one, we've prepared a special playlist that explores the depth of human-animal relationships. You'll find it by clicking to your left. If this story moved you, please don't forget to subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Every day we bring you unique narratives that explore life's complexities and unexpected miracles. What connections have you witnessed between children and animals? What unexplained moments have changed your perspective? We'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Until next time, remember that sometimes the most profound healing comes from the simplest touch.